And welcome back to Matt's Garage DIY. Today we're going to be taking apart a Remington Model 31. So the Remington Model 31 was made from 1931 until 1949, eventually replaced by the Model 870 in 1950. During the span of its life, the 31 went through a variety of changes, all fairly minor changes, some to allow for part interchangeability. And during its life, it also earned the reputation of being a very reliable shotgun. So let's take it apart, put it back together. But first, safety as always. Make sure your gun is empty, nothing in the chamber, nothing in that magazine tube. Good to start working. Time to get started. First off, we're going to remove the barrel. To do this, start by opening the action part way. Next, loosen the barrel lock nut. With the nut loosened, turn the barrel 90 degrees to the left, and the barrel slides out. Next, we're going to remove the trigger assembly. The trigger assembly is just held in by one pin. It pushes from right to left. It's larger on the left side, so you can't push it the wrong way. Just use something soft, non-marring to push that through. You see it starts to come out the other side, easily pulls out. Now to remove the trigger assembly, start by just sliding it forwards towards the front of the gun. You'll see there are two tabs that are going to line up with these grooves. Once that's lined up, the trigger assembly lifts out. You also notice one of the cartridge stops fell out. They are just set in place, one on the left, one on the right. We'll touch on that on reassembly. So just a little closer look, you can see on either side of the trigger housing, there are the two tabs that line up with these two grooves in the bottom. There is some further disassembly that can be done on the trigger assembly. We'll touch on that a little later in the video. Next, we're going to remove the cartridge stops. As you saw, one of them fell out with the trigger assembly. They are just set in place. This is upside down, so keep that in mind, but this is the right side cartridge stop. Just pops out. And then if we lay the shotgun down, looking inside, you can see there's the left cartridge stop again. Just catch the end of it with your finger. Lifts right out. Next, we're going to disconnect the forend from the slide. Basically, you're going to start to work the forend backwards until this little tab lines up with the front edge of the holes for the trigger plate. At that point, you'll then have clearance where you can lift the slide so that it clears from this little tab on the end of the forend. So then simply lift straight up, slide the forend forwards. The slide and forend are now separate from each other. Next, we're going to remove the slide, keeping this little tab still lined up with the front edge of the trigger holes. Reach in, tip the far or the top side towards you, and lift out. So looking inside, we're left with the breech block, the carrier, the extractor, which is down below. You can't quite see that yet. So to remove the carrier, slide your breech block forwards, not all the way, 1/8 to 1/4 inch short of the front. Then you just lift the carrier up like that. Squeeze the two legs together. Carrier lifts out. To remove the breech block, first you're going to reach in to press the extractor right here. Then breech block simply lifts out. Now that I've taken my finger off the extractor, you can see there's some spring tension on that, so you're basically needing to depress that as you lift your breech block out. To remove the extractor itself, sort of lift it up 45-degree angle approximately, and then just pull it straight up towards yourself. You can see there's a bevel on the edge, corresponds with sort of the bevel right in here. Those two interact with each other. To disassemble the magazine tube and remove the forend, we're going to start by loosening this small screw at the front. It will only turn out part way. It only has a very small amount of threads on the end. And then from the back side, you can press that a little bit and see that it starts to protrude or pop up. Just simply grab that screw and pull it out. Depending on the spring pressure that's in your magazine tube, you may want to keep a finger over the end of this. But with the screw removed, then I'm going to just grip the knurled cap, start to wiggle it out. Out comes the spring. Kind of tip the barrel. Lastly, this collar at the end, you can just grip that, wiggle it off, and then your forend slides right off. Next is to remove the stock. With the butt plate removed, there's a hole in the end and a slotted screw down inside. You'll want to use a large, well-fitted screwdriver to remove that bolt. If you end up stripping the head, it is going to be a huge pain to try to get that out later. With the breech block, there are 3 pins to drive out. First is this one that holds in the firing pin. Large side, small side, that drifts left to right to remove the firing pin. The left extractor, this pin drives from the bottom up. Again, small side, large side. And then lastly, the right extractor, you stick a small screwdriver in here, pry back, and then you can twist that out. I'll show you that next. First, the firing pin. Before I pull this punch out, you want to make sure you're keeping your finger over top of that firing pin as it is under spring tension. Firing pin's removed. There's the pin. Next is the left extractor. That will drive from the bottom to the top. Again, before I pull this pin out, I'm going to put my thumb over the extractor. There is a small spring in there. It is under some spring tension. You can finish pulling that pin out. Extractor comes out the side. Small spring right in here. There you go. Now to remove the right extractor. It's a plunger with some spring tension. And then this extractor, basically, I'm going to stick the screwdriver in between the back of the extractor and the plunger, force the plunger back, and then I can kind of lift and slide forwards. There's a bit of a ramp that this extractor has to go up. So taking my small screwdriver, sort of force it in between the two. There we go. So I'm pushing that plunger back. I can then start to use the toe of the screwdriver to lift a little bit on the extractor at the same time while prying back. See, the extractor is starting to come out. Anyways, give that a couple of light taps to get that in there. There we go. Push that extractor back, or push that plunger back. You can see the extractor is loose. There we go. Comes out. Just watch when you take that off, or when you pull your screwdriver out, that this little plunger doesn't go flying. So taking a little closer look at this extractor, you can see there's some little grooves on it. Looking at it this way as well. And then as I dump out the plunger, spring didn't come out. You can just stick a small screwdriver inside. So maybe a little Allen key might work better. See if I can pull that spring out. There we go. Spring comes out. Now looking at the extractor, you can see this is on a slope right there. So as that extractor comes out, you need to push the plunger back, and then you're sort of lifting the extractor a bit to get out of this little well, and then sliding it up that ramp. Now onto the trigger assembly. First, make sure your hammer is in the forward position. Next, we're going to drive out the main spring pin. This is the pin right through the back of the assembly, small on the bottom, large on top, drives up. To drive the mainspring pin out, I'm using a 3D nail. It's a finishing nail size 3D with the point cut off. Place this on a block and start tapping that through. So looking in there, you can see that the second or the larger spring is quite strong. So basically, as soon as that pin clears the hole, it's caught on this pin. So now what I'm going to do is just use a small screwdriver, kind of reach in the side, try to put some downward pressure on that spring, and then I'll finish pulling this pin out. First, I'm actually going to pull the 3D nail back a little bit, just so that it's not caught in the coils of the larger upper spring. So now, again, I'm going to use this like a small jeweler screwdriver, sort of reach beside the spring, just catch the edge of a coil, put a little bit of downward pressure, and then the pin pulls out. So there's the pin out. Next I'll pull the main spring. So I'll basically just hit the end. So this little plunger and spring in the bottom, actually orientation should be that way. Little plunger and spring in the bottom for the safety. Upper plunger and spring interact like that, going into the trigger housing. Now to remove the safety plunger, cock the hammer. It drops this little tab out of the way, and the safety plunger falls out. Next, we're going to drive out the hammer pin, which is this pin right here. Coming out the other side. Pin's out. Now, before you just grab the hammer and yank it out of there, you want to pull the trigger so the hammer goes ahead, and then slide the whole assembly back. See, I've slid it back about this far. At that point, then this will lift out. So if you look inside, there's a spring right here with a little bit of a dog leg. The reason that you're pushing that assembly back is so that it sort of clears the dog leg and is in this area where it's wider before you lift it up and out. Next, we're going to drift out the trigger pin, which is this pin right here. Comes out the other side. Now the action bar lock, and simply just push that up. Comes out. Again, this right here is that spring that I was talking about. Slight little dog leg in the side. And then the trigger. Trigger lifts out. There is a spring on the bottom of the trigger. Mine does not fit in there very well. So it may, when you take this out, if you don't see the spring, just take a look inside the housing. The spring may have fallen out. The last part of this assembly that we're going to take apart are these trigger plate studs. There's one on either side, one there, one there. You can simply just grab those with a pair of pliers, kind of a slight twist, comes out. Only reason you'd ever need to take those out is if they've become really worn for some reason or broken. Anyways, one on each side, they just pull out. At that point, this is as far apart as needs to be. There is one tiny little screw in here that is related to this ball plunger. If you need to take that out, replace any of that, there's a very tiny screw in there. There is also your little action bar right here. There's a pin right there. It looks like you can drive that all the way through from the other side, but again, don't need to take that out for cleaning. Only reason I would drive that pin out is if this piece needs to be replaced. Taking this all apart, let's put it back together. Starting with the trigger. Make sure again that you've got your little spring in there. If you need to, you can maybe put a little dab of grease on the end of this as you put that in, just that it doesn't fall out. If you don't do that, just be mindful. All right, so I'm just going to drop the trigger back in. So that's through the housing. Take a look on from the inside. Now I'm going to reach inside, put some downward pressure on that so that I can align this hole that's in the trigger with the housing itself. And I'm going to start putting this pin in from the bottom up. I do that in part so that I can just put some downward pressure on the bench while I try to align the trigger inside the housing. That just sort of frees up my hands to kind of adjust the pieces, and then just using that slight downward pressure pushes the pin in for me. So for this part, I've actually just put on a headlamp that just allows me to focus a little bit of light inside that hole, kind of get a better view, making sure that those pieces are aligned as I put that pin in. Pin doesn't seem to be going in. I'm going to double check my spring has not fallen out. It has not. Let's try that again. So pin set on the bottom. Start lining up these holes inside. It's kind of a fine dance of pushing down on the trigger and sliding it to the back to get everything to line up just right. There we go. Okay, got the pin started. Only push it through the trigger portion. You still need to put the action bar lock in beside that. So with the action bar lock, there is this little spring-loaded plunger on the back. You just want to make sure that that is pushing against this face when it's inserted. So I'm going to drop this in. Looking right here, my plunger is against this little leg. Front end is in the groove. Again, I'm going to flip this on the side, kind of shining my headlamp inside. Just move this action bar lock slightly backwards, etc. There we go. But by having this set again on that bench so I can put that downward pressure, now I've got the pin almost all the way in. It's through both these pieces. I can just finish that off with a hammer, tapping that to its final place. Now we're going to reinstall the hammer and link bar. Start that link bar into the back of the housing. Again, don't put this right at the beginning or right at the front and push down. You need to be starting here, sort of rear of the little dog leg in that spring, push it down, and then slide the hammer assembly forwards. Now for the hammer pin, it's this pin that goes through here. I start by putting my trigger assembly straight, up and down, vertical, and then cocking the hammer. The reason I put it straight up and down is so that that linkage bar drops straight into the well for the spring. And with the hammer cocked, I found it's easier to line up this pin and hole. So I start that pin in, there you go. Basically pushes almost all the way through just with hand pressure. I'm just going to finish that with a hammer. Now for all the springs and safety that kind of go in the back end. So now I'm going to pull the trigger, releasing the hammer. You want to start with that all the way forwards. That moves this linkage bar forwards, causing the least amount of compression on the spring as you do your reassembly. So now I'm going to drop in the main spring and follower. Follower goes in first, main spring on top. Before I go any further, just going to take a quick look on this side. I want to just make sure right in here that this linkage, there you go, and you can see now that I put a bit of spring pressure on, has lined up with sort of the little cup, and that those two are properly engaged with each other. Now back to the fight with this spring. I've basically taken a screwdriver, kind of filed the end of it so that it will fit inside this spring. I can compress that spring down inside, start my pin. It's in far enough that it has caught the spring, but there's such high spring pressure that when I take this out, I can't push that all the way in. So now I'm just going to use the tip of this, push on the bottom edge of that spring, put a bit more pressure on, allows me to get my pin in a little bit further. Take a peek in there and see that. All right, lastly, I'm going to go back to my jeweler's screwdriver, push on the edge, and then keep working those two till I get the end of the pin sort of into this middle portion. There's a hole in that middle portion the pin needs to go through. At that point, I want to stop because I still need to put in the small safety spring. Okay, just using a small flat slotted jeweler's screwdriver. Push down on the side of the spring, trying to keep out of the way of the pin. So not quite there, but you can see the pin is right just about to engage with the second part. Just going to have to do that a little bit more just to kind of finish getting that properly seated. I don't think I'm going to be able to show you that without getting my hands in the way. I'm going to just keep doing that same process, but honestly, my hands need to be right over top of this for me to do that. So again, just to show you what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be using this screwdriver, pushing on the side of the spring, keeping out of the way of this pin. So pushing down like that, and then I will push this pin in till it starts to engage with this middle section. All right, there we go. Way easier when I could actually have my hands over top working. So next we have the small safety spring and plunger. These two drop them both into the hole. I know this seems a little counterintuitive. Basically, I found some instructions in an old book about how to put the safety together. So bear with me, but drop the plunger in, drop the small spring in, and then, because there is no sort of pressure from the spring, kind of tap that in. See, I can, at this point, maybe put it like this, tap that down. That pin is all the way in. So while I was putting the main pin in, this little safety plunger ended up falling out the hole for the safety button itself. Not a big deal. I'm just going to feed it in from inside the safety hole back in. The only thing you want to do is make sure you've got the correct orientation. Small pin end goes in so that it interacts with the spring inside. I have also now cocked the hammer. That just drops the trigger and kind of this protrusion at the back, fully clearing up this hole inside. Okay, so I now have the little pin just sitting in the safety plunger hole, kind of pushing up from the bottom with the ball of my finger, kind of pressing into that hole. That allows me to raise this, and then I'm just going to reach in with a small screwdriver. There we go. Kind of direct that into the hole. There we go, I got it started. I'm just going to tip it, kind of tap it. There we go. Okay, so now you can see that plunger is ready. Now it is protruding into the safety hole. You're going to be like, what is going on? I'll show you that next. So now to install the safety button itself, I'm going to place that on the bench. I'm going to place this over top. You can see that the plunger is hitting on the button. Again, I'm going to use my jeweler screwdriver, press in on the plunger. Again, now that I'm working sort of using the bench as a kind of an assistant for me, it will put some upward pressure on the safety plunger or the safety button itself. So I'm going to push in on this plunger. There you go. Safety button's installed. Okay, so your trigger assembly is back together. If you don't need to take it apart, I would say don't. As I'm sure you can tell in the video, there are certainly some struggles with taking out and putting in the, especially the main spring at the back there. But it certainly is doable. If you need to do it, that's how you do it. So let's move on to putting the rest of this gun back together. We're going to reassemble the bolt. So we have left and right extractors, firing pin, and the associated pins. With the extractors, there's two springs. Big spring, small extractor, small spring, big extractor. Simple way to keep that straight. So we'll start with, this will be the right extractor. I'm going to take that spring, I'm going to drop it in to the hole that it came out of. It basically disappears inside there. Next, we're going to take the pin, again pointy end into the spring, put that into place in there. All right. You can see that's what it looks like. Now to install the extractor. So to do this, basically you set the extractor right there, slide it down the ramp. You need to compress this spring far enough that this bottom part drops into the well. This end is quite sharp. I'm going to put a leather glove on as I push on that just in case I slip so I don't jam that into my finger. Okay, so I've got the extractor, got it on the ramp, start pushing that in, oops, start pushing that in. You can see right there, it's already part way, it's caught, so just a little bit more inward pressure, downward pressure, I'll have that in place. There we go. Right side extractor is now on. You can test the spring tension on that. Good to go. Now for the left side extractor. Small hole right in there. The spring drops into that. You may need to use a pick or a small screwdriver to kind of get that lined up and in the right spot. Got that set. I'm going to start by running a small punch up through the bottom. It's a little bit smaller than the pin. That's going to give me a little bit of leeway because I want to get this extractor roughly lined up with the hole. This punch, because it has a tapered point to it, will allow me to sort of manipulate that a little easier. There you can see. So I've got the punch that allowed me to line up the hole with the sort of in the bolt itself with the hole in the extractor. Now, with that in place, I can start slowly pulling the punch back down while I put the pin in from the top. Knowing that everything is still basically lined up, I can give that some taps. There we go. Pin's not fully set, but I know that it's through the bolt, through the extractor, well started. Put this on my block. I can finish driving that in. Again, check that spring tension. Looks to be good. Last part of the bolt is the firing pin assembly. So when you look at the firing pin, you can see there's a notch or a groove cut out of it. I have my bolt upside down right now, so I'm looking at the bottom of it. When I put the firing pin in, I want this groove to be down towards my workbench, which is actually the top of the gun. Slide that in. I can start my firing pin, or my retaining pin in the side. Compress that firing pin in. So just kind of double checking inside there. Looks like the firing pin rotated ever so slightly while I was compressing that. Pull that out, double check it. Yeah, there we go. Let's try that one more time. Trying to be a little bit more careful. All right. Not quite. Again, you don't want to force anything. There you go. So I've got that in far enough now. But yeah, don't want to just hammer this all the way in. Basically, while you have the pressure on the end, the back end of the firing pin, you're able to kind of rotate it a little bit. You may need to do that. It has to be perfectly flat for this pin to clear it. Pins in. Push some pressure on the back. Double check sort of that action or the spring action of the firing pin. To reassemble, we're going to start by putting that extractor back in. Again, needs to be on kind of that approximate 45-degree angle so that it drops into that little slot. And you can see spring tension. Depress that, drop our breech block in. Just making sure that this sort of little fin on the side of the ejector interacts with the side of your breech block and the two slide properly. Put the carrier back in. Again, compressing those two legs together slightly. There's two round holes in the bottom, kind of rear bottom, that those snap into. Carrier's back in. Now to install the slide, I'm going to start by sliding my breech block back. Then again, as I go to install this, approximate position, this tab lining up with the two holes for my trigger. Tip that in, bottom edge closest to myself. Drops in on top of the breech block. Now to reinstall the action bar, slide it in over the end of the magazine tube. Now that the action bar has started into sort of this work area, again, you want to keep your breech block and slide still back in this area. That gives you the most room to sort of be able to lift the slide up. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the slide, lift it straight up square, and then slide the action bar underneath the slide, and then drop the slide down so that the little hook on the end of the action bar matches up with this little square right there. So I'm lifting up the slide. I've got that up kind of level. Slide the action bar underneath. Drop the slide back down on top. Now for the magazine tube, I'm going to start by putting this collar on, making sure that the hole in the bottom of both the magazine tube and the collar are lined up. Next, I'll put this plug in, the solid end in first, followed by the spring. Last piece is this magazine nut. You can see there's a hole through the middle of that. That hole needs to line up with this hole here. Be aware this spins and you can take that center hole out of alignment. So you just want to be aware of that as you put this all together. Now I'm going to finish compressing the spring into the tube. Take my magazine nut. As I push this in, I want to do my best to keep that hole lined up with this hole. Press those together. Now, you may need to keep your finger on the end of this, depending on the spring tension. In my case, it does seem to stay together. I'm going to flip the gun over. From this side, I'll then drop in this pin. Now, it appears that my center portion has turned out of alignment, so I'm just going to rotate that back and forth a little bit till I find the correct spot. There we go. Pin's gone the rest of the way through. Push that down. You don't want to hammer on this because you do have those threads, but you want to make sure that it's pushed in far enough that as you start to turn this with a screwdriver, those threads will catch. So the magazine tube is now reassembled. Now for the cartridge stops, they do have this peg on the back and there's a matching hole. These just set into place. There is a left and a right. Nope, got to set into place. I'm going to just keep my finger under my thumb on that so it doesn't fall out. Tip this on its side. Drop the left one in. Both cartridge stops are in place. If you have your stock removed, you'll want to reinstall that or put that back on before you put your trigger housing in. Trigger housing fits into this notch at the back, so that's why you need to put this stock back on if you've already removed it. So put the stock on, slide that on. Again, I've got this large bolt, drop it in the end of the stock, tighten it up with a flat screwdriver, put your butt plate on, your stock is reinstalled. Time for the trigger assembly. Again, remember you've got these two little locking lugs on the side that match up with these grooves. So start your trigger at that spot. There is also this spring-loaded ball at the back, so that provides a little bit of tension that you need to sort of compress or overcome to get this started. Making sure this is lined up. Push your trigger down into place. Pull it to the back. Lastly, you can put in your trigger pin. We're going to reinstall the barrel. Again, make sure that this lug is 90 degrees to the left. Install the barrel, or slide the barrel in. You will need to make sure that your breech is partway open if you're doing that. And then twist the barrel 90 degrees down. And you're done. So there you go, Remington Model 31. Take it apart, put it back together. Hope you liked the video. If you have any tips, tricks, be sure to share those in the comments. And as always, click that like and subscribe.